All right, so on Friday we left off looking specifically at the First Amendment, which guarantees the civil liberty related to religion, right? Religious civil liberties protects, as we already said, civil liberties are protections on our rights from encroachment of our government, so it protects us from our government. And we were talking about the Establishment Clause, right? The Establishment Clause quite clearly says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. We talked about how yeah, at first, right, we had to look at did that apply to the states, and we kind of talked about the incorporation doctrine and what that did. But where we left off, we need to pick up and kind of acknowledge that the Establishment Clause, just because it says that Congress can't make a law creating a national religion or preferencing a national religion or preferencing religion over non-religion, they also can't preference non-religion over religion. And so it does get tricky when we're dealing with issues related to government funding for religious schools. Um, Obviously, if you look at colleges, for example, we have Georgetown and Notre Dame and Gonzaga and Loyola Marymount and so many others, right? Regis up in Denver, that have an affiliation with a church, whether it's a specific branch of the Catholic Church or various Protestant churches or religions. Um, they do get Pell Grants, right? They get Pell Grants that allow students to go to school, and so they are getting funding. So it would be inaccurate to say that government can give no money to religious groups. Um, Religious schools get money quite often, right? St. Mary's High School gets grants from the federal government pretty much every year. But the reality is that there are, coupled with those grants, a significant amount of restrictions on that. Um, St. Mary's can only use the funds um, generally for facilities, not for curriculum and not for teachers. Um, and if they are getting funds for a teacher, for example, for a grant, that teacher cannot teach any religious class. So if it's a fund for a gym teacher as part of a grant to lower childhood obesity, um, that would be fine. And so, if St. Mary's or Notre Dame or Georgetown takes federal dollars, then they must allow access to non-religious groups in addition to religious groups. So we talked about that, right? So Atlas um, wanted, we rented out our gym and we got contacted by, a church down the road who wanted to rent it from us. We couldn't say no. So long as we rent that gym to other non-religious groups, then we have to rent it to the religious groups and vice versa. Um, when we look at colleges, for example, colleges, when they receive federal dollars, are bound to play by federal rules. Colleges like CU Boulder, for example, or UCCS or CSU Pueblo, if I wanted to start a Quaker student group, right, or a Taoist student group, would have to be funded if that college is also funding non-religious groups. And again, vice versa. If you go to a religious college and that religious college is funding religious groups and they get federal money, then they have to also fund non-religious groups. So the Establishment Clause has repeatedly been tested many, 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 many times over the years. And essentially what you're picking up on is that when we say that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, essentially what it means is that government can't preference religion just as they can't preference non-religion, right? They basically cannot take a side. Um, when the funds are being directed for religious education at these schools, the threshold for constitutionality is significantly higher, and it's very difficult for like a St. Mary's High School or a Gonzaga University to take money and then use it to hire any sort of religious programming or use it for religious programming. One of the must-know cases that we are going to be reviewing here this week is Engel v Vitali. In this case, the story essentially was there was in upstate New York a high school that basically during the morning announcements, right after the morning announcements, there was a prayer. And students in their homeroom would have to basically either engage in the prayer or sit quietly while students prayed around them. Um, this obviously was challenged all the way to the Supreme Court, and essentially it was found um, that basically, because it was a public school creating an opportunity for prayer, they were endorsing religion and were in violation of the Establishment Clause. And so there is no prayer as part of any classes whatsoever. Any prayer over a loudspeaker, any prayer anywhere in formal like daily programming of the school is going to be denied as part, in violation of the Establishment Clause. Now, Alabama has famously, Alabama University, Alabama high schools have famously created essentially moments of silence that have been upheld by courts as okay if there is no prayer and it's just a moment of reflection or a moment of silence that some kids choose to use for prayer, other kids choose to sit there and doodle. That has been allowed. Now, if we look here on the Establishment Clause with regards to like curriculum decisions, the obvious choice here is with regards to whether or not you teach evolution, right? Do you teach evolution? Evolutionary biology is pretty much accepted science at this point. But if you were to go to certain sects of Christianity and Islam, evolution is seen as blasphemy, right? And a lie. And that intelligent design, meaning God did it all and evolution is a giant hoax, is is considered the truth. And so some schools have, particularly in, Bible Belt states or rural areas of Bible Belt states, have embarked on a science curriculum at the high school level in biology where they teach intelligent design alongside evolution. And that, even though you're saying, well, you're teaching both, so therefore you're not really establishing any, the Supreme Court has upheld that the teaching of intelligent design in a public school is unconstitutional because it is not supported by science. Now we talked about the Ten Commandments in government buildings on Friday. The posting of it is advocating and is unconstitutional, especially as long as you don't allow other groups to post theirs. Now you ask, what about Christmas nativity scenes, outside of courthouses or outside of city halls or outside of government buildings? Could there be a nativity scene on the front of City Hall with it's clearly little baby Jesus in a manger. It's telling the nativity story. Is that in violation? And the courts have said no, that is allowable because Christmas has essentially morphed into a secular holiday, sort of divorced for the majority of Americans, they said, from its original religious purposes. And so it's more of a cultural expression as opposed to a religious expression, and therefore it's okay. Now, if that seems a little bit like mental gymnastics to get to that interpretation, again, that's how the courts work, right? We see the Constitution, we hear the arguments, and the court chooses basically how they're going to define it, right? Is this far enough, or do they want to push the boundaries a little further and say that's okay now? Um, and so, the law is constantly evolving in courtrooms as arguments are made, challenging what many people would assume are well established, right? Like the First Amendment was passed, the First Amendment means what it means, and that's as simple as that. Now, rather than kind of belabor this, you can just pause your lecture and kind of look at these. I think there's some good things here that are relevant. The black and white picture in the middle is the picture from Engel v Vitali in the 1960s in upstate New York with prayer. But rather than waste time on this, again, you can pause and look at it. Let's go forward. And so let's take a look at the second part of the First Amendment. The second part of the First Amendment, dealing with religion, if the first is the Establishment Clause, the second religious part is the Free Exercise Clause. This clause essentially immediately follows the as it stands. If you were to read the First Amendment, it says Congress shall make no law establishing a national religion or establishing a religion. Um, and there's a comma there, and then it says, nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof, which is basically come to be known as the Free Exercise Clause. That basically Congress can't make any law establishing national religion or establishing a favoritism of non-religion over religion, but it also can't basically deny people the freedom to believe or worship as they please. The free exercise says Congress can't stop you from practicing your religion. Now, you can obviously think of exceptions. The picture on the top left is the famous TLC show, Sister Wives, dealing with polygamy, right? Multiple wives is illegal. So, how can you forbid somebody from having multiple wives if their religion says it's allowable? And so, obviously, this has been defined in the courts and clarified over the course of the last couple hundred years. But, it comes down to the essential part here that people have the right to believe what they want. Um, but people may have the right to believe they want, but in general, courts have been more restrictive on the actual practicing of these beliefs. So, if you want to say the government is telling me that I'm not allowed to believe in the giant spaghetti monster and I'm a Pastafarian, um, that would probably, you'd win that challenge. The government can tell you what to believe. But if you wanted to say, well, as part of my Pastafarianism, I believe in um, ritual human sacrifice and cannibalism once every year on the giant spaghetti monster's birthday. Um, that would be restricted, right? Because how you practice your beliefs is generally allowed by the courts to be kind of more strict. And so essentially the legal challenge is, to what degree are you allowed to practice your beliefs? Go to church? Sure. Go to your, temple? Fine. Um, have this holiday where you get together and you do these pretty innocuous things? Fine. Um, but what happens, if you are a Christian Scientist and you don't believe in, the application of our modern medicine? You say God, will save you and through prayer. Are you allowed to deny your kid treatment for a curable form of cancer? Are you allowed to, as a religion, like a Mennonite or an Amish person, can you refuse education for your children and say, hey, we don't believe in formal education. They will basically learn everything they need to on the farm. What about polygamy? What about, peyote use, which is um, basically a drug that comes from a cactus in the desert southwest in northern Mexico that Native American tribes would use in rituals, in spiritual experiences. What about female genital mutilation? Can you basically do female circumcision and remove all of the nerve endings? What about human sacrifice? Obviously, each of these things has been defined as no, right? Although, let's be clear here, drug use, I, as 37-year-old Mr. Novak, couldn't say, oh, I want to go down and do peyote. It's part of my religion. But there are some exceptions. If you are a member of a certain tribe of the desert Southwest, you are allowed. So, how far the fences are pushed, and this is far enough, and take a step back. You've gone too far. This is how the courts work. Now, in general, if I, in a state legislature or Congress, want to make a law interfering with religious practices, the court will allow it, um, so long as the law is very narrowly tailored. If I say you can't do ritual human sacrifice, that will be fine. But you can't do any rituals involving human beings in, states of distress, probably not. That's too vague. And you can't. you can only limit these religious practices if you have a compelling interest.